Thank you, Mary. Thank you for that. Yes, and thank you for your prayer. I appreciate your mentioning the fellowship and communion of the saints. It's important. Confucius, in the opening words of his Analects, says in English something like, "Is it not wonderful when good friends gather together from distant places to converse together about matters of common interest?" That's one of his more thoughtful sayings that does not turn up in the fortune cookies, but it's a good one, and it comports well with your prayer this morning. Thank you. Well, yes, even on the banks of the Nile, we see if we can come up with that lost sheep that you were all counting all night long last night. You remember where we were. The arrow was a little more wiggly this morning, but nonetheless, the overall direction remains clear, as you can see. So we wound up with our picture here of Mark feeding into Matthew and Luke. In their own way, Mark being drawn upon by both Matthew and Luke, as we've indicated by those green lines underneath. We talked about the oral tradition hovering over the whole process, and today we'll pick up and go a little further, as we just began last night, with the idea of one portion of that oral tradition congealing into a collection of sayings, aphorisms, punchy little sayings of Jesus, which it looks like may well have been in written form, and which the scholars call, as many of you had already picked up on, you're ahead of me, as usual, to call Q. So you then wind up with the idea of Q feeding also, whether written or oral, however we want to think of it, feeding also into Matthew and Luke along the way. So we wind up with something very like the two-source theory then for the Synoptic Gospels, the source of Mark into Matthew and Luke, and also Q feeding into Matthew and Luke. I've got my little laser thing here, which I meant to grab beforehand. Let's see if we can make this work here. Yeah. So you see how this works, and that has been known for a long time as the two-source hypothesis. Thanks, Eva. It's today known as the two-source theory. Those of you in the sciences know the difference, and you understand that that means an advance of some kind on the understanding of what's at stake here. So here we are with both Matthew and Luke receiving both from Mark and from Q separately. That's the basic idea. Last night, we wound up taking a look at a Q piece, that is to say, story B in Matthew's story of the stilling of the storm. Matthew has combined these two sources into one integrated story. Story A and Story B last night, right? Story A being Mark's story, which he has reworked a bit on the actual crossing of the sea and stilling of the storm, but sandwiched into the middle, what we called Story B, that is of people who wanted to follow Jesus. And along through the course of those paragraphs, he has interwoven them to bring out new lessons of what it is to be a church in the midst of storm and wind blowing in many directions, what it is to be a follower of Jesus and to encounter those storms with the full knowledge and conviction that Jesus is in the middle of the storm with us. And even when the wind is blowing, to remember where is our faith. So we did that last night, and as part, and that part of Q, if you want to take your little folder here that you have and flip 4 or 5 pages into it, you will find a sheet, looks like this, called, it's very simple, little half sheet, just a little listing of things. Q samples. Now these are really samples. Q material is a substantial chunk of both Matthew and Luke. If we really were to list all of the bits and pieces that look to us like Q material, it would fill several pages. I just quickly grabbed a couple of the more familiar things that you will recognize without even having the text before you. You know, the Beatitudes, the Sermon on the Mount, the Lord's Prayer, things like that, that you will all quickly read. That is Q material. That is what we owe to Matthew and Luke. We don't have in John, we don't have in Mark. These are sayings of Jesus. And there are many, many more. But as you look at that list, you'll notice right up at the bottom of the list there, we have what I promised to talk a little bit more about today, the story of the lost sheep. At the top of the list, we have following Jesus. What's involved in that? That is the piece we looked at last night. Someone wants to follow him. Jesus says, well, if you're going to do it, really do it. But be aware that there are storms involved. Son of Man has no place to lay his head. Yeah. So the top of the list is where we were last night. Let's drop right down to the bottom of the list now and pick up on another one that is also familiar. We know it well. It appears in Luke in a sequence of 3 parables. That is to say, the lost sheep, the lost coin, where the woman had 10 shekels and discovers she's got 9 and the one is missing, and she sweeps the house, turns it up. And finally, the lost son, which we know as the prodigal son or the waiting father. That too is only in Luke. Only Luke has that one. But the lost sheep, Luke and Matthew both share. And they are close enough to each other that it looks like they are working with these chunks. And so if you'll turn the page to the next sheet, the lost sheep, you'll see them in parallel there, left and right, the Lucan version and the Matthean version. And just for the moment this morning, let's start with Luke just to get into that. It's Luke chapter 15, and on the horizontal sheet there, you see it. The tax collectors and the sinners were all drawing near to him, and the Pharisees and the scribes murmured, saying, "This man receives sinners, yeah, and he eats with them." And so he told them this parable. Now that much is mortar between the blocks, yeah? This is Luke's own framing material that he has used to set the stage for the building block. Now, the building block itself begins in verses 4 and following. What man of you, Jesus puts it here, and we have it in Luke in the form of a question from Jesus to his audience. It's not a parable, it's more like a simile or a metaphor. What man of you, having 100 sheep, if he's lost one, doesn't leave the 99 in the wilderness and go after that one which is lost until he finds it? Yeah, a common situation. Shepherds taking care of flocks out in the desert. Really, it's got scrubby desert. Rough countryside. There are hyenas and other predators, and so there's the question of looking out for every one of them, constantly recounting, discovering that he's down to 99. Now, what do you do? If there's another shepherd with his flock nearby, you can say, hey, Ahmud, my sheep, I'm missing one. Would you keep an eye on my flock for a while? I'll see if I can round him up, find this little guy. If there's no one and you're out there by yourself, what are you going to do? You kind of weigh and balance the lost sheep against the 99. If I go after that one, these are untended. There is a kind of a judgment call at work there, right? Now Jesus says, yeah, but nonetheless, you would quickly go, hoping to find it without placing your 99 at too much risk, yeah? And when he's found it, verse 5, we read, he lays it on his shoulders, rejoicing. And when he comes home, he calls together his friends and his neighbors, saying to them, rejoice with me, yeah? I found my sheep which was lost. You can see the text on the screen there. Just so, even so, I tell you, there'll be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over in 99 righteous persons who need no repentance. Now, this is familiar material. You know it well. If I back up the screen and we look at this, we remind ourselves that this is indeed one of three parables, bang, 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 one right after the other, in Luke 15. And it turns out that Luke is kind of doing like Matthew. He can cluster together these stories of Jesus, as Jesus himself may very well have clustered them. This may go right back to the historical Jesus himself. Lost sheep, lost coin, lost son. There are differences among them, and many a good sermon has been preached that the lost coin didn't know it was lost and didn't know how to get found. The lost sheep knew it was lost but didn't know how to come back. And the lost son knew he was lost and knew how to come back home again. So you kind of get those sort of parallels going, and that's interesting dynamic in itself. But when Jesus tells this story, and as Luke stitches these three together, we notice that Luke is after another element in all of this, and I've highlighted it right here. You see the word rejoices, and then he comes to the neighbors, and again he says, everybody, that sheep that was lost, I found it. Let's have a celebration. My students in Asia once raised their hands and impertinently asked, how did they celebrate? Did they eat the sheep? I don't think so. But moving right along, we see again the joy, So Luke is really pushing this button, isn't he? Rejoice, he rejoices, he asks the neighbors to rejoice, and in the application then, when Jesus says in heaven, the response over a sinner, the response is one of joy. Now, of course, all of this is kind of Jesus' comeback to the sour faces who are saying, he associates with unsavory types. And Jesus says, celebrate. The kingdom is a kingdom of joy, and he gives this illustration. When we go on with the other two parables, it's exactly the joy. The woman finds the coin and calls the other neighboring housewives and says, I found it! And they all are happy together, and even the parable of the prodigal son. There are stories of prodigal sons in a number of the world religions. The Buddhists have a very famous one. That's a kind of a common theme in ancient parables. They're known around the world and across the faith traditions. But only Jesus has that elder son who is grumpy. Remember? And kind of says, well, I don't think so. That statue, you're all familiar with the Good Samaritan one on our Loma Linda campus. On the La Sierra campus by the same artist. This is this story of the lost son who comes home with the father rushing out to greet him and the elder brother kind of standing back and looking doubtful about the whole thing. It's very powerful. If you ever visit the La Sierra campus, it's right out in front. Don't miss that. It is a message in bronze. Very, very well done. But the theme again is joy. That's our point this morning, the celebration. That's Luke's take on this thing. But of course, when we back up a bit and we run down through Matthew, we find Matthew is headed a different direction. And here is an excellent example of the way in which these gospel writers took these chunks, took this basic building material, whether it was oral or written, from the living memory of the community, and spun the gospel in the particular emphasis that each wanted to really hit. Matthew's quite Judaic, he's quite rabbinic. Matthew is the one who is quite sober in his story of Jesus, emphasizes the law. It's to Matthew, for example, that we owe that saying in Matthew 5:17, don't think that I've come to destroy the law and the prophets and all of that. Matthew's pretty serious on his take of Jesus and the meaning of Jesus. So Matthew is not opposed to rejoicing. Indeed, he actually uses the word once, which probably tells us that the word rejoicing was in the original Q material. Yeah. But Luke takes its single appearance and multiplies it to hit that rejoicing idea again and again. Matthew, as you can see in the highlighted blue material, is going another direction. He sets it up with a saying from Jesus about looking out for the little ones whose angels continually see my Father in heaven. And then again, the question, what do you think? If a shepherd, this is hypothetical now, in third person rather than second person plural, shepherd has 100 sheep, one goes astray, doesn't he leave the 99 on the mountainside or on the hillside and go in search of the one that went astray? And when he finds it, truly I tell you, he rejoices. There's that word rejoicing. But Matthew doesn't do anything with that. He doesn't pick up on it. It was probably part of Q in the first place, yeah? Rejoices over the 99, so it's not the will of your Father in heaven that one of these. Matthew doesn't, in his summary, drawing out the lesson, doesn't hit rejoicing again like Luke does. Rather, he says, he picks up the theme that he wants, which, as you can see here on the screen, is what? Yeah, the little ones. Yeah. Now, that's interesting. If you will take that same sheet that you're looking at, flip it over, look at the backside. You're going to have to turn your binder around, get it aligned. You can see what's going on here a bit. This is Q material. The story of the lost sheep is only in Matthew and Luke. Mark, however, does have an expression once in his gospel, once, in Mark 9:42, the little ones, the little ones. It's there. And Luke, faithful to Mark, keeps it, yeah, over in Luke 17. This is unrelated to the story of the lost sheep. Luke's doing his own thing, puts this in his own place. But yeah, so you can see that going on there. It's there. It's kind of a passing item. Neither Mark nor Luke builds on it or does anything in particular with it. It's part of the tradition, and so they use it. Matthew, however, has this expression 5 times in his writings. Matthew takes that little one's expression and multiplies it throughout his gospel in various places. Matthew 10, if anyone gives a cup of cold water to one of these little ones who's my disciple. Matthew 18, anyone who causes these little ones who believe in me to stumble. That is the one where Matthew actually appears to be indebted to Mark. That may be where he got the expression in the first place. Yeah? But then he has multiplied it, 18:10, don't despise the little ones. Yeah? Matthew 18:14, your Father in heaven is not willing that any of these little ones should perish. So Matthew is taking advantage of this. I said 5 times, it's 4 in his gospel. Yeah. So this is something important to Matthew. Matthew seizes upon this, takes his Q material, yeah, and uses it in a way that includes and embraces an expression from the Markan tradition about the little ones, multiplies that, spins it out to really punch that and drive it home in his gospel. Once again, we see Matthew, the one who interweaves, who takes from Mark and takes from Q and stitches them together in a unique way that is particularly his device and his approach to the whole issue. So here we are. We've got this shepherd, we've got this found sheep out on the hillside and rejoicing. When you make the decision, do I leave the 99 and I go after the little one? It's only a little one, you know, maybe I could afford to lose it, huh? But no, Jesus says, no, that's not the way. Even the little one you should go after, which kind of drives the point home even more. It is not incidental that you're taking some risk. You're leaving the 99, you know, you're going after that little one. Yeah. Let's kind of take that shepherd coming back rejoicing with a little one on his shoulder And let's kind of just sort of freeze frame him right there. You know? We'll come back to it. We'll come back to it. But we'll put him into sepia tones for a moment here now. Freeze frame him. And let's go back to the technical stuff that we've been talking about and bring it in alongside and see what we can do with this. So moving along through this now, a story of the other Muhammad Ali, not the heavyweight prize fighter who is retired in Michigan, no, but another one on the other side of the world, a fellahin, a farmer who lives in the along the Nile, yeah, and here he is, kind of a toothless old rascal, actually, as you can see here. Let's back this up and see if we can make him actually. Let's see here. Make this play. Yeah. Okay, I think this is where I turn to my able assistant, Professor Kohan, to make this actually happen. There it goes. I was looking at this, but not that. Okay, thank you. Got to direct my eyes the right direction. Thank you. Nag Hammadi, as the locals call it. In America, we've Americanized it to Nag Hammadi. Halfway up the Nile, where the Nile has high cliffs on either side, and on this western side is the bluffs there are called Jebel al-Tafsir, as I recall. Steep, crumbly stuff, eroded heavily, as you can see. It's really only interesting to the farmers in the area for just one reason. These higher cliffs up above are the homes of cliff swallows who build their nests by the thousands up along in there. The soil is what they call tufa. It's soft, and cliff swallows can easily dig their holes up into that. Well, where there are cliff swallows, there are, how to put this genteelly, let me just say that the ground below is rich in fertilizer. I think that's the way to put it, you know. Lots of good nitrates and phosphates and so forth. And so for centuries it's been a practice for these folks to in between each growing season, to get some of this rich soil mixed with the guano and load it into baskets on their camels and take it to their nearby village. Qasr is nearby, and use it as enrichment to their gardens, which are otherwise just sand, you know, and you've got to get some nourishment into that somehow. So that's the story there. So here is Muhammad Ali himself. Let's see if we can make him happen here. Just thought you'd be interested in actually meeting him. 1945, December, he and his brother Khalifa and half a dozen friends have organized a day-long expedition over to those cliffs to dig up the soil. And as they're digging, particularly along a big boulder, they're mattocks. They're like hoes, but the blade is turned the same way the handle is rather than crosswise. Down under the soil, they strike something. At first they thought it was rock. Turns out it wasn't. Turns out that the thing was a huge storage pot. Pots were used for storing grain, barley, storing water, storing olive oil, storing valuables. This one is about 6 feet high, yeah? Big old thing. We've got a number of those in our archaeology museum at La Sierra. And by the way, quick footnote here. You will appreciate, if you're ever in the Riverside area, you get a chance to go over to the La Sierra campus. Stop in at the School of Religion and ask Doug Clark or another one of the faculty there who can take you over to take a look at the collection of some of the materials we have. From that time, ancient time, 2,000 years ago, Roman period, Iron Age, and that part of the world, Egypt, Jordan, Palestine, Judea, and environs. We have been pronounced by the experts who work in this material to have the finest collection in North America, or outside of Jordan, actually, of Transjordanian Iron Age artifacts at all. No museum, no university, no, not Yale or Harvard, has a collection that surpasses ours. We are extremely fortunate. We have a dozen or more of these huge pithoi, as they're called, big old storage pots for all kind of utilitarian purposes. And sure enough, turns out that they're into one of those. They've gotten to one of those things. They gingerly dug out around it, not sure they should be messing with it. These are highly superstitious villagers. They're very concerned, on the one hand, that it might contain a jinn, a desert jinn, which we know in English as a genie, yeah? You know, Aladdin and all those stories, yeah? Yeah, well, genie is just our word for jinn. It's an Arabic term, and you don't mess with those, you know. So if there's a jinn inside here, we better leave him alone, you know, and not release him into the world. Pandora has already done her work. We don't need it repeated again, right? On the other hand, these things were sealed up for a purpose and buried for a reason. This thing is sealed with an inverted bowl over the top and bitumen all around, like tar or pitch, you know. Something is valuable inside. And ultimately, the combination of curiosity and greed, it might be valuable gold or something, got the better of them. And they finally work up their courage, smash this thing open with their mattocks, and as Muhammad reported it, yes, the breeze was blowing and little specks and sparks of gold flew up, which we now know were microscopic little flecks of papyrus. It was books, materials, written material. Disappointing to them, worth more than gold to the rest of the world. An amazing story. They were disappointed, you know, they kind of hauled this stuff out and so here we go. This is the kind a sample of the result here. Let's back up and see if we can capture that in motion. Well, let's see. We won't worry about it if we can't. There it goes. Give you some idea of what we're looking at. These are not scrolls. That's the first thing you'll notice, right? These are books. Each book in those days known as a codex, C-O-D-E-X, and it was kind of a new form. It was new technology, sort of like iPads or something, you know, laptops or something. Codices, plural. And it may be that these were most common among Christians, actually. We think Christians may have invented this form about the time of the time of Christ or directly thereafter. Pages, a little rough, a little worn, and having suffered some maybe before being sealed in there, but for a millennium and a half, something like that. They've been buried in that jar. Maybe eroding somewhat, but nonetheless protected. Now the problem, of course, with finding something like this that's been preserved for centuries is that once you expose it to the air and once you expose it to human beings, it's doomed. It's just everything starts to go bad from that point on. Muhammad and Khalifa, his brother, there are 13 of these codices, yeah? And there are 8 of them. How do we share them up? Well, kind of rip them apart and kind of, yeah. So that's the first division right there. And they're kind of disgusted, don't know much what to make of any of it, but Khalifa and Muhammad brought theirs home at the end of the day, kind of disgustedly tossed it out in the central courtyard of their home, and let it lie there, kind of dumped it all there and let it be. That is but the beginning of sorrows. Things go downhill rapidly after that. Back up 6 months beforehand. This was December of 45. In May 7 of 45, a bit of tragedy had struck this family. The father of Muhammad and Khalifa Ali was a night watchman, and his job was to guard irrigation equipment that was stashed out in the desert. And one night a marauder came around, and as these things go, I think maybe without asking any questions, Ali simply shot him. Well, it turns out he was kind of a well-known big man and the leader of another tribal group. Muhammad and Khalifa belonged to the Al-Saman tribal group. This is another tribal group in a neighboring village, and he was kind of an important person. And you know enough about the Middle East to know that this is how family feuds get started. And they go for generations. It's easier to start one of these things than to ever put a stop to it. So by the next day, before the next day was over, back in May 8 of 45, Muhammad's father had been shot in return, just like that. And a month later, Muhammad and Khalifa find out who did it, or who was alleged by the villagers to have done it, and hacked him to pieces with their mattocks. Well, now the fat's in the fire. As you can imagine, this thing's going to go. And it goes down rapidly from there. Eventually, the police, who tend to kind of look the other way when these things get started, if it gathers enough momentum, as it did in this case, there was an instance of someone from the other village shooting up a procession in Muhammad's village, a funeral procession, and killing half a dozen people. Indeed, Muhammad himself has a scar. A bullet just grazed him. And things are going downhill pretty rapidly, and so finally the police rather reluctantly get involved. Well, once that happens, the police have a tendency to kind of search everybody's house. Muhammad was concerned that the police might search his house. It wasn't that he valued these things, but they were a burden now. They were becoming a detriment. And he's afraid they're going to find these scraps of manuscript. And it is illegal to deal in contraband and antiquities stuff. And so he's afraid he'll get in trouble for that. So to get rid of what's left of them, I say what's left, because Muhammad's mother had been using the sheets to start the family cooking fire each evening, yes. But to get rid of what's left, he goes to a relative of his who is a sister who is married to a man who can read a bit, and the man looks at one sample. Muhammad takes one sample, and the man says, well, that's Christian. He could recognize it was Coptic script, you see. And so finally, Muhammad takes what he has and places all with that guy, because he's a priest, actually, a Coptic priest. And surely the police won't search his home. He's not related to this matter at all. And Muhammad is kind of relieved to be rid of the whole mess and wash his hands of it. He's got enough problems, as you can imagine, going along. Eventually, the priest who knows someone in Cairo who he gets in touch with through an intermediary, a traveling teacher who comes through town. It's a complicated story, as these things always are. And the antiquities dealer says, well, it's in pretty rough shape, which it was by then. And he says, but I'll give you a little something for it. The other bits and pieces throughout the village are disposed of for a pittance, and they also begin to deteriorate quite rapidly. You can see, probably some of this deterioration happened through the centuries before they were exposed to the air, but even more afterwards. This is deterioration, typical deterioration of bookworms, not the human kind, as you can see, but also of human mishandling after the stuff is found. And it all gets scattered and dispersed and begins occasional sheets and bits and pieces in a very typical fashion begin to turn up in the antiquities market here and there. And the academics who keep an eye out for this kind of stuff begin to gradually realize there's been a find. Somebody has been into a burial plot or a cave or something somewhere, and we need to get to the bottom of this. And so there was an attempt some years later now to gradually trace back until they were able to converge the story of this material back to Nag Hammadi area. The result is that there were then discovered to be some 13 of these codices, or what's left of them. They can determine there were that many, maybe 14 originally, but a certain amount has been destroyed. They're leather bound like this, and they're about like this, just little, kind of what we would call handbooks, something like that. Perhaps no larger in their dimensions than our hymnal, something about like that. Typically, they have leather thongs around them. A couple of them didn't, but most did. Inside them are bound a variety of what are called tractates. That is to say, different books, writings of various kinds, bound together under this cover. So those 13, maybe 14, of which there are 12 and fragments remaining now, these codices have 52 tractates scattered through them altogether in the aggregate through them. There are some duplications resulting in 45 different things altogether in there, and half a dozen of them or so are things that we have already known. I mean, one is an excerpt from Plato, for example, well known, no particular surprise there. But something between, some of them are things that we knew only in fragments. Some of them are things that we knew existed, but only fragments of are here also because of destruction and loss in the process of disseminating this material. So even so, we can recognize a good 30 or more new things that we didn't know about at all. This is a considerable find. They're in Coptic. Coptic is the language of, ultimately, back to the pharaohs. It's Egyptian language. It's translated material from Greek. These were all originally in Greek, put into one or another of the Coptic dialects, Sahidic or Amharic or Bohairic, and different handwriting, apparently, although they can recognize some of the same hands across these books. They apparently come out of a library originally, somewhere nearby in the area called Chenobastion is a community of Christians who had libraries. But eventually, as the centuries go by, Athanasius particularly is concerned. There's the persecution of Christians is stepping up and increasing. This is before Constantine. It's serious. Athanasius gets after this community and tells them that they need to purify their texts and get rid of anything that is suspicious. He thinks they should burn or otherwise destroy whatever they have that looks a little questionable. His definition of questionable is anything that is mystical, that has the idea of kind of God within us or us within God or something like that. We'll talk more about that a little later. And these monks apparently, obeying the spirit, if not the letter, of the regulation, rather than destroying these things, actually sought to preserve them, but got them out of their library where they would, so the library would pass inspection. The interesting thing is that what was saved for the library is long gone, deteriorated for sure. These were made on papyrus. Now, papyrus is a highly fragile and quite perishable substance. Indeed, it's made by splitting the reeds of a particular plant that grew in the Nile. Still does today, though it's not used for that purpose. I brought some. I'll send this around. This is not a manuscript, and it's modern. But this is a painting of how the Pharaoh has to be judged after he dies, and his heart is being weighed to see whether it passes the test for eternity. I don't know how to circulate this. I'll start it here. And as I describe what this is, you can tell with your fingers, you'll recognize it. The papyrus reed has a stem, so about this wide. It's triangular in cross-section. Split it longitudinally, and you get the pith out of it. You can get it into thin strips, which you can then lay side by side. Yeah? You lay them side by side like fingers. And then over the top of that lay strip, you don't interweave it, just over the top going the other direction, and then really squeeze it down hard with a great deal of pressure and weight on it, and the natural juices in there will themselves serve as a kind of glue that holds the whole thing together. And it comes out, this is the color it comes out in. Unfortunately, when exposed to sunlight, it darkens. And when exposed to moisture, you can imagine, it just falls apart into fibers, So papyrus is something that can be used for purposes that are usually kind of temporary. For valuable books, they tended to use parchment or vellum, with skins of animals scraped very thin. But down there in Egypt, parchment was much cheaper. Papyrus was much cheaper, and so they just did that. Now, as you look at the front and back of that, you'll notice the grain goes two different directions. One side vertical and the other horizontal. That's exactly how they do it. So whatever survived in that library, precisely because it was preserved in the library, is gone today. It was probably gone within a matter of years. It was what was hidden, exactly to get rid of it, so to speak, that it was preserved. Isn't that an interesting little paradox? But Athanasius got his way for the time being, and out of this comes this whole collection. You'll find, let's see, just a couple of pages before, let's see here. Yeah, just a couple of pages before the, let me look at this quickly for you here. Yes, about two or three sheets in. On the left-hand side, you'll see a listing. The Nag Hammadi Library on the left, yeah? About 3 pages in, 2 or 3 sheets in to this from the cover sheet. And I've listed there the titles of all of these works, most of which were either unknown or were known to exist but we didn't have, or if we had anything, we had a few quotations or a fragment or two, yeah? So this is really quite a find. as you can see, it's a massive amount of material despite the loss. The Roman numerals are the numbers of the codex. The slanting italicized Arabic numerals are of the tractate within the codex. So you can see them listed down through there. You will find particularly on the left-hand side as you go down about the 8th entry, the Gospel of Thomas. And that's one that I want to pick up on for a moment to see this morning. The scholars were asking about Q. What kind of a funny gospel is that? It has no story of Jesus, doesn't start with his birth, doesn't end with his crucifixion, resurrection. There's no narrative sequence. It's not a biography. In what sense is it a gospel? Did people actually collect sayings? And there was a good deal of wondering about that until such time as this material came to light. Now, this material from Nag Hammadi didn't really get published for some years because in 47, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered by that little shepherd boy. Yeah? A fascinating story in itself, though it has no direct connection with Christianity. But they were so taken with all of this Essene material, we think it is now, Dead Sea Scrolls, that the Nag Hammadi material kind of languished for a while. Gradually, it has been published as scholars have gotten back into it, pulled it back out and edited up and looked at it. Some of it pretty crummy, as you can see. Hard work to get it reestablished and recover the text, in some cases. But gradually, they were able to do that. And one of those texts is indeed called Ta Evangelion Kata Thomas, the Gospel of Thomas. Yeah. The title is in fact in Greek, but the actual text is in Coptic. Coptic is Egyptian written with Greek letters, and some letters added because, as you know, so often happens, the Egyptian language has sounds that Greek doesn't have. So they invented a few letters to flesh out the phonetic system, and you can almost, in fact, read it. Those of you, there are several of you in the room who have had some exposure to Greek, who know it a bit. When you look at this stuff and you know Greek, you're tempted to try to read it. You can almost make it out. Indeed, when it's transcribed by hand into clearer form, here is a hand transcription of it. It really is tantalizing to people who are familiar with uncial Greek manuscripts. The opening words here at the beginning, the secret sayings which the living Lord told to Didymus, yeah, that's Thomas, yeah, Judas, Thomas, Didymus, Judas, Thomas, Judas, Thomas, the twin. Now, this is not Judas Iscariot. Judas was a common name. And then it goes on to say, whoever knows the interpretation of this will never see death. And even though this is Coptic, not Greek, those of you with sharp eyes who know a bit of Greek will recognize here the word hermesia, yeah? The interpretation, our English word hermeneutics is related to it, yeah? So, you can kind of pick out words as you go down through it, even if you're not really schooled in Coptic. This is the Gospel of Thomas. Here is a manual transcription of it. Again, we saw how it actually came out and looked in here. But in so doing, you can find, I've given you some examples. If you can flip a couple pages back toward the back once more, the sheet that we were looking at called Q samples, these were the Lord's Prayer and the Beatitudes and so forth. These are all paralleled in Thomas. Thomas has roughly this same material, which sounds rather familiar and yet kind of different. Flip that page over now, and on the back side you will see Q Thomas samples. These are the same selections as I had on the front side of that same sheet, now with Thomas added for you to compare. Here's Thomas on following Jesus. saying number 86. By the way, there's 114 sayings, 114, 114 sayings. Here's number 86. How are we doing? Did that get around pretty much? Yeah, it's okay. You can keep it. On the other side. Okay, we'll do that. And here it is. Foxes have their holes, birds have their nests. The Son of Humanity, that's the Son of Man, does not have anywhere he can lay down his head. And rest. The and rest is the added part there. Yeah. The Beatitudes from Thomas, you can see, blessed are you poor, heaven's reign is for you. That's close to Luke, isn't it? The Matthean version, blessed are those of you who are poor in spirit. That the agreement of Thomas and Luke with each other probably tells us that it's Matthew who's spiritualizing the Beatitudes. Thomas and Luke both have, blessed are you who are poor, plain old poor. Yeah? And probably Matthew who says poor in spirit. Yeah? Blessed you who are hungry. Again, Thomas and Luke both have you who hunger. Matthew's the one who says, who hunger and thirst after righteousness. Matthew is the spiritualizing one here. But apparently the original form may be closer to something much more material than that. Blessed are you who hunger, in order that the stomach of the one who craves for it may eat its fill. Little different spin there, huh? Little different. Rather than simply you will be satisfied. Blessed are those who have been persecuted in their heart, whatever that is. Blessed are you when they hate and persecute you. Golden rule, Thomas, Codex 6, Tractate 3, do not do what you hate. Love your neighbor as yourself, give to those who cannot return. We have in Thomas 95, if you have money, don't lend it out at interest, rather give it to someone from whom you will not get it back again. Again, the speck in the beam, the speck in your brother's eye you see, the beam in your own you don't see. When you throw out the beam from your own eye, then you clearly see to throw out the speck from your brother's eye. Lord's Prayer. I put it in here just to note that it doesn't appear at all in Thomas. Just thought you'd be interested in that. That simply doesn't have it. Sermon on the Mount. Don't be anxious from morning to late, from evening to morning, with what you will clothe yourself. Again, 36:4. Who can add to your stature? The one who will give you your clothing. The stature and clothing kind of interwoven there. But now we come back, dear friends, in our closing minutes. We left the shepherd kind of freeze-framed with that sheep, huh? Let's pick it up now with Thomas and see what he does with it. Somebody read that for us. Somebody read that for us.
Kingdom is like a shepherd who has 100 sheep. One of them went away, the largest. He left the 99 and sought the one until he found it. Exhausted, he said to the sheep, I love you more than the 99.
Whoa. Wait a minute. Now that's interesting, isn't it? What did Matthew say about that sheep? The little one. What have we got here? You know, that judgment. Do I leave the 99 and go after? Well, if it's a little one, yeah, maybe I can avoid. But if it's the biggest one, oh, well. Yeah. This is the big fat one, the favorite one. Yeah? I'm going after him. I'm going to bring him back. And when he gets back, we can almost visualize him patting that sheep on the head. Oh, sheep, I love you more than all of the 99. That maybe helps us understand why Matthew punches the little one so much. Yeah. We're not sure where to put Thomas in terms of timing. We're not sure. It's partly a question. We know there's Greek behind this. It's partly a question of the oral tradition behind the written. That's always the case. Where do we put Thomas? Do we put him here, as you can see? Yeah. Or here? Or here? Yeah? This looks like it might be traceable in written form back to about the first quarter of the 2nd century, maybe to 130, something like that. But how far back does the oral tradition go behind that? And what does it tell us already about Christian shepherds. The word pastor means a shepherd, right? Who maybe already, this early in the church's history, are beginning to go after the fat cats. Yeah. Those with the influence and the money. Of course, pastors today don't do that, but in those ancient times, it was a temptation. See? Yeah, right. Seriously, I think it was partly a desire, understandable, for respectability, public acceptance. You know, if you get the pillars of society to be Christians, and not just the slaves and the military types and like that, uneducated people, it's harder to throw the pillars of society before the lions next Sunday afternoon. You know, there's some strategy behind that. We've got to be a little forgiving of this, but it may say something. Matthew's gospel, in a way, is shaped almost like a church manual. We don't have time to talk about that today, but Matthew's gospel is clearly shaped for the needs of the church after Jesus, and it has rules about how the church is to do its business. Indeed, Matthew 18, that same chapter, if your brother sins, you go to him first, and then you bring one or two with you, and you forgive and forgive. All of that, that's only in Matthew. Matthew is laying out some principles and practices for church life. And in effect, by sharing with us this saying about the little ones from Jesus, Matthew is saying pastors should be looking out for the little ones, not just the big fat ones. You know? Well, Matthew is, in a way, taking up the other end of the case. Matthew and Thomas represent different attitudes. The one in Thomas may be sarcastic, maybe ironic, poking fun at such pastors. Don't know. Who are the little ones? They could be children, to be sure. They could be people who are new in the faith, yes. They could be simply people who are not important in society. Paul himself, of course, as we know, writes in the first chapter to the Corinthians, "Consider your calling, my brothers and sisters," we would say today. "Not many of you are well born, not many of you influential." Indeed, later on, he calls them the offscourings of the gutter. Now, that's fairly strong language, but he admits that Christians are kind of despised, lower caste people, and the result is that Christianity doesn't gain a lot of public respect. But here, it may be that the little ones are people who are, in fact, not contributing much positive. They're not an asset to the abbey, as the line goes from The Sound of Music. In that case, we may have an indication in the actual text itself of tension within the church, of who should be members, who should be at least sought after, and whom the pastors should be caring for and looking out for. Then we have a double source, the two-source hypothesis. Now we can call it a theory because it's sufficiently well established. Matthew and Luke borrowing from Q, Matthew and Luke drawing from Mark. This is sometimes called the triple tradition, just the double. But Q is not Thomas, and Thomas is not Q. They're not the same. Nonetheless, Thomas does several things. Thomas validates that people collected the sayings of Jesus as a separate category. The fancy word is genre, a separate category of material from Jesus. They did that. Thomas proves it. The Gospel of Thomas proves that they did that. It also gives us some insight into the tensions in the church, even in early days, as to what should be the role of pastors toward their church members, their flock. Do you leave the 90 and 9 to take care of themselves, or you go after the one who has strayed? What do you do under those circumstances? But Thomas does much more also. We won't have a lot of time to talk about him more this week, but he does also open our eyes to less familiar material, which may not at all go back to Jesus, stitched in right alongside these samples that I've given you here. There is much more in Thomas that is familiar, and there is much more that is unfamiliar, and some that is just plain loopy. It's really strange stuff. We won't have time to look at that in detail, but I may pick up on it in a few references later in passing as we can. The lost sheep, then, has been found and found and found. Whether in Luke's Gospel, in Q beforehand already, in Matthew, and he finally winds up along those barren and bleak cliffsides halfway up the Nile River. A little different treatment, a little different message, but still that famous sheep, which opens our eyes to something that we really do owe to those farmers, illiterate as they were, Muhammad Ali, his brother Khalifa, and those other guys. We could wish that they might have handled the material a little differently in some ways, but there's enough that comes through to open up our eyes to the great diversity, the currents and streams in the early church, in different times and different places, so diverse that we can hardly speak of the early church at all, but may need to speak of the early churches. One thing it does take away from us is our idealized picture of an early church, perfect and uniform, that makes us want to say, if we could only get back to the spirit of the early church. Well, the answer to that is yes, but define which of those early churches first of all before we go further with that one. Yeah. There's more to say, but we'll draw a line of mercy across these proceedings now and see where it goes from here. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, it's your turn again, Mary.
Oh, great.
Burton Mack, he placed Thomas in the last quarter of the first century.
Yes.
And he also said Thomas was a non-apocalyptic spirited literature, whereas Q started that way, but Q developed an apocalyptic.
Yes.
Considering 2,000 years has gone by, isn't there some consideration to take a look at why they didn't think it was apocalyptic? I mean, there's a long time's gone by. We still have this say.
Why they don't see Thomas as apocalyptic?
No, why we continue to hold to the same apocalyptic. Is there something else that they were saying that is possibly true?
Yeah.
You know, I don't want to throw any doubt on it, but I just want to throw the idea.
Well, your question cuts right to the heart of the real issue. I was dancing a little around that one, but I'll try to dance less now that you've asked that penetrating question. To quickly get a little context in all of this, yes, Thomas and Q are different in a number of ways, as I have indicated, and this is one of them. The word apocalyptic here is a particular kind of literature that reflects a particular kind of thinking. Apocalyptic writing, we as Adventists know well because Daniel and Revelation are good examples of it, from Judaism and from Christianity. Yeah? This represents a period from about 400 years before Christ, or less, to a couple hundred years after Christ. And it's in both Judaism and in Christianity. In a breath, it goes like this. The time will come. This is different now. This is different from the classical prophetic model. The classical prophetic model said every day and in every way things would get better and better, particularly after they came back from Babylonian captivity, the Jewish people. That we would build the temple, rebuild the walls, build up the city, and the city would gradually get bigger and bigger until it fills the whole of Judea, and the kingdom of God would be spread increasingly around the world until all nations would be gathered together. People would live for a long time. When you're 100 years old, you'd still be an infant. There would be gradual peace, lions and lambs lying down together, children playing with snakes and not getting bitten. Much more. All nations gathering from new moon to new moon and Shabbat to Shabbat. and gradually the kingdom would evolve around the world. That's the evolutionary picture. It didn't happen. We've got that figured out. That much is clear, right? So, as it didn't happen, the prophets, always resourceful and ever adaptable, still convinced, as we said last night, that God acts in history, came up with a new model in which they inverted it, which said that the time will come, in fact, when things have to get not better and better, but worse and worse. At which point God will ultimately, when the cup of iniquity is filled up, will blow the whistle on the whole world and destroy everything, this time not with flood but with fire, and start over again and remake the world new heaven, new earth. That will be the process involved in a great cosmic clash in which the forces of the universe, God and angels on one side, malevolent satanic forces on the other side, human race divided in between, no more middle ground, very decisive. Earmarks of that kind of thinking and that kind of literature are numerology, angelology, rankings of heaven, mysterious signs, symbols that are difficult to understand, an interpreting angel standing by the side, and so forth. We Adventists have tended to not recognize the difference between apocalyptic and classical prophecy. We've lumped them all together. But Daniel and Revelation are actually that special kind of prophecy in which things don't get better but get worse. Now, what do we make of Jesus in that context, and what do we make with this material in that context, which is really your very perceptive question? It looks to those who really tease apart. They've been able to take Q and kind of reverse engineer it back into a source. And they have chapters and verses they've assigned to it. The problem is circular reasoning, because we don't have many external checks to work with here. It looks like three layers, Q, A, B, and C, or 1, 2, and 3, if you like. Strata like a birthday cake or something, yeah? And as the way they've reconfigured it, or assembled it, I should say, looks like the earliest strata are not particularly apocalyptic. Not so much of that blood and thunder, hellfire and brimstone kind of interpretation of where history is going, and a sudden inbreaking of God's kingdom with a final last judgment and Armageddon and all of that. Layers 2 and layers 3 look increasingly apocalyptic. Now, the problem, of course, you will already immediately recognize is, what are the criteria by which they establish those layers? Well, one of the criteria is the presence or absence of apocalypticism. So there's a real risk of circular reasoning in that. Nonetheless, they've done the best they can. There's been some very thoughtful and extensive work sorting through vocabulary, syntactical forms. Computers help with this. And it is beginning to look like Q grows progressively apocalyptic through some years, some decades. All of this has got a little cloud of doubt hanging over it, and the scholars involved recognize that, but they're doing their best. Now, we don't have that in Thomas. It's just not there. We don't have a final judgment, the whole thing about sins and sinfulness and all. I've given you today a handout of the entirety of Thomas. I wanted you to be able to look at the whole thing in perspective. I considered typing out more selections from it, but I wanted you, those of you who picked up the other handout this morning, if you don't get it when we break in a minute here, so that you have the whole thing, all 114 sayings. You will find, first of all, that there is nothing of this kind of apocalyptic thinking, blood and thunder, cosmic showdown, final judgment, sin on an individual basis somehow. It's just not there. Indeed, the one time where the word sin comes up, Jesus is presented as kind of pushing back and resisting that idea on an individual basis. Rather, then what is Jesus good for in Thomas? What is he about? Well, there is another model in the ancient world, and that is of the wandering, charismatic wonder worker and, more importantly, wise revealer of hidden truth. Yeah, that was a kind of a standard model. There were other people who flew under that banner. Jesus is presented as saying mysterious things, which, if you understand the hidden inner meaning, will give you the prospect of eternal life. That's what Jesus is about in Thomas, what he's good for, what he accomplishes. Now, this afternoon we're going to look at that again in another context, another document. But your question is, how much longer, O Lord, can apocalypticism hold water for us 2,000 years on? Or is it right to ask of the earliest Christians, were there some other currents and strains that we might appropriate to make sense out of Jesus 2,000 years down the road today? It is an audacious and courageous question. We may need to say a little more about that on tomorrow morning, Sunday morning, when I kind of try to round up all of these lost sheep and see what we can do with it. But the question of to what extent that kind of a Redeemer, Savior figure can really work for us today is still an open question and still very much being discussed. One of the difficulties with it is that it sounds kind of spacey and mystical, and our country today is not in a mystical or spacey mood. We are in a very hard-nosed, hard-headed, and judgmental mood right now, vis-a-vis Islam and some other things going on in the world. So there's not much patience with airy-fairy answers about these things. But nonetheless, there is at least a subcurrent within Christianity that is increasingly beginning to add their voice to yours to ask that question. That took me too long to spell out. I'm sorry, but that's what's going on beneath the surface a little. Yeah.
We have one more question before we break.
Apologies
Okay.
for rattling on that one, but it's a complex question. You understand? Please.
You indicated that the monks or priests in the was it 2nd century were cleaning house because of
Athanasius
the inspection.
and others were.
And you said that what they were trying to clean away was the mystical, the Jesus or God in me. And yet in John 17, there is very much I in you, you in me, and so on. What was it that those early bishops were afraid of with the mystical stuff?
Good one. John had the hardest time getting accepted of the Gospels into the canon, just for that reason. They were uncomfortable because John has Jesus speaking in Gnostic terms. In the beginning was the Logos, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and it's already getting that direction. It's moving that direction. And so finally, the acceptance of John into the canon, which is so different from the other three, grudgingly was granted, but Thomas was just a little further down the same road and was not accepted. So this was a close judgment call. John was a marginal case. They kind of closed one eye and said, okay.
Because it seems that in the early church, the subjective experience was very important, and around the 3rd and 4th century, the Catholic Church, as it was, became more scholastic oriented and drove that down into the background. And it seems like now it is coming back in the church, except that I hear that in the General Conference president is very concerned about meditation, about focused, what's he call it?
Spiritual formation.
Spiritual formation, which it seems is really going back to what it was in the early Christian church.
Yes, in a short word.
And what is it that we're so concerned about, Dr. or President Wilson and all this stuff?
We have to define the we when you ask that question. Even Catholicism has had the wisdom to at least make room within sacred orders, holy orders, for people like Teresa of Avila and Eleanor of Bingen and St. John Canossa and St. John of the Cross and others. Catholic Church has always had its mystics. Every religion is nervous about mysticism. Catholics are, Muslims are. It's common. Mystics are a problem to all groups because many times they're closer to each other and understand each other better than their compatriots within the core center of the religion they belong to. You remember Merton Thomas visiting Buddhist monks in Thailand when his life came to a close, Thomas Merton. That has always been a little edgy for some groups. But at least the Catholic Church was willing to always preserve a stream and a trickle within the monasteries for that kind of thing. We don't have a monastic tradition. We have denominations. That's the closest we come. Some have had more of a leaning that direction. Some have had less. But today we are determined, it seems, to out-Catholic the Catholics.
All right, we've got about 11 minutes before our next meeting's scheduled to start, so why don't we take an 11-minute break and then we'll get started again. All right, take a breather.